Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of Environmental History Worth Reading. I'm Sean Courage, one of the editors here at niche-canada.org, and as usual, I am joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I'm the niche social media editor.
So, Jessica, we're looking back at the month of March 2017
Mhm.
for what was best on the web for environmental history, and you've picked 5 items here. And we begin with a piece written over on the Rachel Carson blog, Seeing the
Mhm.
Woods, by John McNeil, which is part of a new series called Uses of Environmental History.
Yes, basically, McNeil's point is that environmental historians don't have to be useful, and that we can feel free to be as useless as we want to be, and that very few environmental history projects or history projects in general would be validated by the usefulness of the project. And that's his argument, and that curiosity is a valid reason. But if you want to be useful, you can do it through three main avenues, he argues.
Hmm.
One, you can connect to journalists and other people in the media that can popularize your work. You can specifically pick a topic that is involved in current events. Or thirdly, you can reach the public through teaching your students environmental history. Um, so that's his argument. I have some issues with it, which I'm going to be discussing on a niche New Scholars Roundtable that will be out soon.
Stay tuned.
um, but he kicks off the series, and it did produce a lot of reaction, both
Hmm.
good and bad, on social media networks.
Yeah,
So,
keep an eye on that one, viewers, because it'll be interesting to see the subsequent posts that come out in that series.
mhm,
Your second pick is over at Bori, Alia. It's a 3-part series about teaching early Canadian history in the United States.
mm-hmm. So this includes 4 historians, including our own Claire Campbell. And the 3-part series is very good. They talk about their own biographical story about how they became Canadians who teach in the US. They talk about what American students know about Canada, which is basically nothing. Um, they talk about the primary sources that they use. And then where it ties into environmental history is that they spend, I believe the third installment of the series spends a lot of time talking about environmental history and specifically how this field tackles the challenges of transnational scholarship and transnational education. So I highly recommend checking this series out.
Yeah, this one looks really good, and that came out very recently.
Mhm.
The third pick for this month comes from a post on Huffington Post about plastic, kind of history of plastic.
This is the most popular post, I think, in March that I saw. And in this, they talk about how every single piece of plastic that has ever been made still exists,
Hmm.
which is a pretty crazy thing to think about. And the author talks about the upswing of plastics and how it was first developed as a way to stop using as much ivory, so make plastic billiard balls, plastic combs, etc. But the real upswing came after World War II. That's when there's mass production assembly lines, and also there's a need for cheap products because the industry is booming,
Hmm.
but they want to keep people buying plastic, so they start making plastic everything and making it cheap. Um, so they talk about that, and of course the masses of plastic that are in the ocean, and how uh, the first plastic that was created is it's still 500 years from disintegrating. So it's a pretty interesting, thought-provoking piece. Um, I didn't know the exact origins of plastics, so.
Yeah, it's a good connection to for historians of energy history who look at consumption of petroleum, because often, of course, in energy history, we're looking at forms of burning petroleum, but petroleum is also used for manufacturing, and this is where we get
Yes.
the history of plastics. We have some Toronto history, which appeared over at The Guardian last month. A little bit of an insight into the relationship between the city and the history of mining.
Hmm. So this relationship isn't anything new to a lot of environmental historians, but I think probably the greater public, as the article argues, does not know about it.
Hmm.
So it begins with the most recent Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada meeting that's held in Toronto. And the author talks about how 75% of companies, mining companies in the world are headquartered in Toronto,
Hmm.
and that there is probably no capital market as specialized as Toronto is in mining anywhere else in the world. So I
Hmm.
didn't know the statistics. Um, and that it argues that even though the industry is so prevalent in the city, it's barely discernible to most residents, and you really have to dig to find the connections. And then it goes into the history of how this came to be, and how mining was seen to be the way to progress for both the countryside and the metropolitan areas. And it also talks about some of the issues with foreign companies and not the willingness to make sure that their behavior is good. So the outsourcing, the environmental degradation, and labor issues,
Hmm.
etc. So I thought it's a long read and a good one. So.
It's one of those areas in Canadian environmental history where Canada is very much a large part of the global history of mining. So obviously, as you said, Canadian historians of mining are well aware of Canada's role in mining, and other historians of mining are aware of this. But it raises questions for understanding urban history, Canadian business history, and of course, Canadian environmental history.
Yeah.
So your last pick is a look at bears, and particularly the polar bear, a little bit of an animal history of the polar bear.
Yes, this is a post that's mainly about a new book called Ice Bear, the cultural history of an Arctic icon. And so the author argues that no animal divides opinions as much as the polar bear, and that it's admired for its seeming freedom and calm, and the fact that it's a loner, kind of does what it wants to do. And they look at the way that the polar bear has been used in popular imagery. It looks at how it's a representation of true self. It looks at it as a sexual predator or stud.
Mm.
Um, and also, of course, modern day uses of it as a mascot for climate change on both sides of the argument. So I just thought it was an interesting one, and also one that got a lot of feedback on social media networks. So a fun way to wrap up the month.
Yeah, the visuals on that one are fantastic.
Hmm.
If viewers want to read more of Jessica's picks, you can find them over at niche-canada.org each month in our series Environmental History Worth Reading. Jessica, thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean.